In the grand palace of El Escorial, just outside Madrid, there hangs a portrait that has haunted historians for centuries. The man in the painting stares out with cold, calculating eyes, his face bearing the unmistakable marks of the Habsburg bloodline that had ruled Spain for generations. This is Ferdinand VII, a king whose reign would be marked by betrayal, violence, and a cruelty so profound that it would earn him a place among history's most reviled monarchs. But what made this man so different from other despotic rulers? What drove him to commit acts that shocked even his own contemporaries in an age when brutality was commonplace among royalty? The story of Ferdinand VII is not just the tale of one man's descent into tyranny. It is the story of a nation torn apart by foreign invasion, civil war, and the dying gasps of an empire that once spanned the globe. It is a story of how absolute power, when combined with personal weakness and vindictive cruelty, can destroy not just individual lives, but the very fabric of a civilization. To understand Ferdinand, we must first journey back to the Spain of the late 18th century, a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. The Spanish Empire, which had once been the most powerful force on earth, was crumbling. The wealth of the Americas that had made Spain rich was drying up. Revolutionary ideas from France were seeping across the Pyrenees. And in the royal palace in Madrid, a family drama was unfolding that would have consequences far beyond the palace walls. Ferdinand was born in 1784. The eldest son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. From the moment of his birth, he was heir to one of Europe's oldest monarchies, but also to its problems. Spain in the 1780s was a nation struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world. The American colonies were becoming increasingly restless. The French Revolution had sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. And Spain itself was divided between those who wanted to embrace Enlightenment ideas and those who clung desperately to the old ways. Charles IV was not a strong king. History remembers him as weak-willed and easily manipulated, more interested in hunting and clockmaking than in governing his vast empire. The real power behind the throne was Manuel Godoy, a young guardsman who had caught the eye of Queen Maria Luisa and risen with meteoric speed to become the most powerful man in Spain. Rumors swirled around the royal court about the exact nature of Godoy's relationship with the queen, rumors that would follow the royal family for decades. Growing up in this atmosphere of court intrigue and whispered scandals, young Ferdinand learned early that power was something to be grasped and held at any cost. He watched as his father was manipulated by ministers and favorites. He saw how easily a monarch could become a puppet in the hands of more cunning individuals. And he vowed that when his time came to rule, things would be different. But Ferdinand's path to the throne would be unlike anything any Spanish prince had experienced before. In 1807, when Ferdinand was 23, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. The French emperor had conquered most of Europe and was now turning his attention to the Iberian Peninsula. Napoleon needed Spain as an ally, or at least as a compliant neighbor, in his ongoing war against Britain. The opportunity came when Charles IV and his son Ferdinand became embroiled in a bitter family dispute. Ferdinand had grown to despise Manuel Godoy, seeing him as a usurper who had stolen his father's authority and possibly dishonored his mother. In 1807, Ferdinand was actually arrested and charged with plotting against Godoy and, by extension, against his own father. The scandal rocked the Spanish court and revealed to all of Europe just how dysfunctional the Spanish royal family had become. Napoleon watched these events with the calculating eye of a master strategist. Here was his chance to bring Spain fully under French control. He invited both Charles IV and Ferdinand to meet with him in the French town of Bayonne, ostensibly to mediate their dispute. What happened next would change the course of Spanish history forever. At Bayonne, Napoleon pulled off one of the most audacious political maneuvers of his career. Through a combination of threats, promises, and sheer force of personality, he convinced both Charles IV and Ferdinand to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. Charles IV abdicated in favor of his son. Ferdinand accepted the crown, and then Ferdinand was pressured into abdicating in favor of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. In a single stroke, Napoleon had effectively conquered Spain without firing a shot. Ferdinand found himself a prisoner in the luxurious but nonetheless real captivity of the Château de Valenciennes in France. For the next 6 years, while Spain erupted in a savage war of independence against French rule, Ferdinand would remain in elegant exile, waiting and planning for his return. But what was Ferdinand thinking during those long years of captivity? What kind of man was he becoming as he watched from afar while his kingdom burned? The evidence suggests that rather than learning humility or developing sympathy for his suffering subjects, Ferdinand was nurturing a deep well of resentment and a thirst for revenge against all those he held responsible for his humiliation. The Spain that Ferdinand had left behind in 1808 was a nation in agony. The Spanish people, who had initially been indifferent to the dynastic squabbles of their royal family, rose up in fury against the French occupation. What began as scattered local uprisings quickly grew into a coordinated resistance movement that would tie down hundreds of thousands of French troops for 6 years. The Spanish War of Independence, or the Peninsular War as it came to be known, was a conflict of unprecedented brutality. French forces, trained in the conventional warfare of Napoleon's other campaigns, found themselves fighting an entirely different kind of war against Spanish guerrillas who struck without warning and melted back into the countryside. The French responded with savage reprisals against civilian populations. The Spanish guerrillas replied with equally brutal attacks on French soldiers and Spanish collaborators. Meanwhile, in the parts of Spain not under French control, a remarkable political experiment was taking place. Spanish patriots had gathered in the port city of Cadiz and, in the absence of their king, had written a new constitution for Spain. The Constitution of 1812, as it came to be known, was one of the most liberal documents of its age. It established a constitutional monarchy, guaranteed individual rights, and limited the power of both the king and the Catholic Church. The men who wrote this constitution believed they were creating the framework for a new Spain, a modern nation that could take its place among the enlightened countries of Europe. They looked forward to Ferdinand's return, expecting that he would gratefully accept the role of constitutional monarch and help lead Spain into a new age of prosperity and freedom. They could not have been more wrong about the man who was waiting in France to reclaim his throne. In 1813, as Napoleon's empire began to crumble under the weight of the disastrous Russian campaign and the growing coalition against France, Ferdinand's opportunity for return finally came. The Treaty of Valenciennes, signed in December 1813, provided for Ferdinand's restoration to the Spanish throne in exchange for Spain's withdrawal from the anti-French coalition. Ferdinand's journey back to Spain in the spring of 1814 was a triumph. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered to welcome back their king. The Spanish people, exhausted by 6 years of war and foreign occupation, saw Ferdinand as their liberator, the symbol of Spanish independence and national renewal. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. But even as Ferdinand basked in the adulation of his subjects, he was already planning his revenge. The liberal politicians in Cadiz, who had written the Constitution of 1812, expected Ferdinand to honor their work and accept the limitations they had placed on royal power. They were about to discover just how badly they had misjudged their returning king. On May 4, 1814, Ferdinand issued a decree that shocked liberal Spain and sent a chill through every progressive heart in Europe. With a single stroke of his pen, Ferdinand abolished the Constitution of 1812, dissolved the liberal Cortes, and restored absolute monarchy in all its traditional forms. The men who had fought to create a new Spain found themselves branded as traitors and revolutionaries. But Ferdinand was just getting started. What followed was a reign of terror that would make Ferdinand's name synonymous with reactionary brutality. The Inquisition, which the liberal Cortes had abolished, was restored in all its medieval horror. Thousands of liberals were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, or executed. University professors who had taught Enlightenment ideas were dismissed. Books were burned. Newspapers were shuttered. Ferdinand seemed to take personal pleasure in the persecution of those who had dared to limit his power. He would often personally review the cases of political prisoners, sometimes commuting death sentences to life imprisonment, sometimes confirming executions with apparent relish. Contemporary accounts describe a king who seemed to delight in the fear he inspired in his subjects. Why was Ferdinand so vindictive? What drove him to such extremes of cruelty? Some historians point to his years of captivity in France, arguing that his humiliation at Napoleon's hands had warped his personality and filled him with a need to dominate others as he had been dominated. Others suggest that Ferdinand was simply revealing his true nature, freed from the constraints that had held him back during his youth. But there may have been another factor at play. Ferdinand was acutely aware that he was not a strong man in the traditional sense. He was not a great military leader like Napoleon. He was not a charismatic speaker who could inspire loyalty through force of personality. He was not even particularly intelligent or well-educated. What Ferdinand had was his royal blood and his willingness to use terror as a tool of government. Ferdinand's personal life was equally troubled. His first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples had been arranged for political reasons and was reportedly unhappy. Maria Antonia died in 1806 before Ferdinand became king, and rumors circulated that Ferdinand had been cruel to her during their brief marriage. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal, lasted only 2 years before she died in childbirth, along with their daughter. Ferdinand's third marriage, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was another political arrangement that produced no heirs. It was only with his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, that Ferdinand finally achieved his goal of producing a male heir to secure the succession. But even this late success came at a cost that would ultimately tear Spain apart. The question of succession had been a constant source of anxiety for Ferdinand throughout his reign. Spanish law followed the Salic law, which prevented women from inheriting the throne except in very specific circumstances. Ferdinand's brother, Carlos, was next in line if Ferdinand died without male heirs. But Carlos was a staunch traditionalist who made even Ferdinand look moderate by comparison. Ferdinand feared that his brother's extreme conservatism might provoke another revolution. When Ferdinand's fourth wife gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, in 1830, Ferdinand faced a dilemma. He could accept that his brother would inherit the throne, or he could change the succession law to allow his daughter to rule. Ferdinand chose the latter course, issuing the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which revoked the Salic law and cleared the way for Isabella to become queen. This decision would have catastrophic consequences for Spain. Carlos and his supporters, known as Carlists, refused to accept the legitimacy of the Pragmatic Sanction. They argued that Ferdinand had exceeded his authority and that the traditional succession law could not be changed by royal decree. When Ferdinand died in 1833, leaving behind his 3-year-old daughter as his heir, Spain erupted into civil war. The First Carlist War, which lasted from 1833 to 1840, was a conflict that divided Spanish families and communities. On one side were the supporters of Isabella II and her mother, Maria Cristina, who served as regent. These liberals and moderates wanted to modernize Spain and bring it into line with other European constitutional monarchies. On the other side were the Carlists, who fought for Carlos and for a return to absolute monarchy, traditional Catholicism, and the old regional privileges that centralized government had eroded. The war was fought with particular savagery in the Basque provinces and Navarre, where Carlist sentiment was strongest. Both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were routinely executed. Civilians suspected of supporting the enemy were murdered. Entire villages were burned. It was as if all the hatred and division that Ferdinand had sown during his reign was finally erupting in an orgy of violence. But even as Spain tore itself apart in civil war, Ferdinand's reputation continued to darken. More and more evidence emerged of the systematic cruelty of his reign. Foreign diplomats who had served in Madrid during Ferdinand's rule wrote memoirs that painted a picture of a king who seemed to enjoy the suffering of others. Spanish exiles who had fled the country during Ferdinand's persecution returned with stories of arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and execution. Perhaps most damning of all were the accounts that emerged of Ferdinand's treatment of his own family and courtiers. Stories circulated of a king who would humiliate his ministers in public, who would promise pardons to political prisoners only to revoke them at the last moment, who seemed to take pleasure in creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty around him. One particularly revealing incident occurred in 1820, when a military revolt forced Ferdinand to restore the Constitution of 1812. For 3 years, Ferdinand was compelled to rule as a constitutional monarch, accepting the limitations placed on his power by the liberal constitution. But even during this period, when Ferdinand was supposedly powerless, he managed to convey to his supporters that he was merely biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to restore absolute rule. That opportunity came in 1823, when a French army, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, invaded Spain to restore Ferdinand's absolute power. Once again, Ferdinand found himself dependent on French military intervention, but this time he was determined to make the most of it. The restoration of absolute monarchy in 1823 was followed by another wave of persecution that was even more savage than the first. This time, Ferdinand's revenge was systematic and thorough. Military officers who had supported the constitutional regime were cashiered, imprisoned, or executed. Civilians who had held government positions under the liberal regime were purged from their jobs. The universities were closed. The press was muzzled. Even the Catholic Church, which had generally supported Ferdinand, found itself under suspicion if individual clerics had shown any sympathy for liberal ideas. Ferdinand seemed particularly vindictive toward those who had held prominent positions during the constitutional period. Rafael del Riego, the military officer who had led the 1820 revolt, was captured and executed with elaborate ceremony. Hundreds of other liberals met similar fates. Thousands more fled into exile, many never to return to Spain. What made Ferdinand's persecution so effective was not just its breadth, but its unpredictability. Ferdinand would sometimes spare individuals who expected to be executed, while condemning others who thought they were safe. He would offer pardons and then revoke them. He would promise mercy to those who confessed their crimes, only to punish them anyway. The goal seemed to be not just to eliminate political opposition, but to create a climate of fear so pervasive that no one would dare challenge royal authority again. Contemporary observers struggled to understand Ferdinand's motivations. Some saw him as a king who genuinely believed in the divine right of monarchs and was determined to preserve that principle at any cost. Others viewed him as a weak man who used cruelty to compensate for his own inadequacies. But there may have been a more prosaic explanation for Ferdinand's behavior. Spain in the early 19th century was a nation in terminal decline. The American colonies were in revolt and would soon be lost entirely. The economy was stagnant. The social fabric was fraying. Ferdinand may have recognized that traditional monarchy was the only institution holding Spain together, and he may have concluded that extreme measures were necessary to preserve it. If this was Ferdinand's calculation, it proved to be tragically flawed. Rather than strengthening Spanish monarchy, Ferdinand's reign weakened it catastrophically. By the time of his death in 1833, the Spanish crown had lost almost all credibility among educated Spaniards. The liberal ideas that Ferdinand had tried so hard to suppress had not disappeared. They had simply gone underground, gaining strength and radicalism from persecution. The Spain that Ferdinand left to his infant daughter was a country exhausted by decades of war, oppression, and decline. The Carlist wars that followed Ferdinand's death were in many ways the inevitable consequence of his policies. By refusing to allow any legal outlet for political opposition, Ferdinand had made violent revolution the only alternative to absolute monarchy. Ferdinand's international reputation was equally dismal. Other European monarchs, even those who shared his conservative views, were appalled by the extremes of his persecution. The Holy Alliance, the conservative coalition that had restored Ferdinand to power in 1823, began to distance itself from Spanish policy as Ferdinand's excesses became widely known. Liberal opinion throughout Europe viewed Ferdinand as a monster, a throwback to the darkest days of royal despotism. Writers like Lord Byron and Victor Hugo used Ferdinand as a symbol of everything that was wrong with absolute monarchy. The very name, Ferdinand VII, became synonymous with reaction and cruelty in progressive circles throughout Europe and America. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Ferdinand's reign was the way it squandered Spain's potential for renewal. The Spanish people had shown during the War of Independence that they were capable of heroic sacrifice for their country. The liberal politicians in Cadiz had demonstrated that Spain could produce statesmen capable of creating progressive institutions. The very fact that Ferdinand felt compelled to use such extreme measures to suppress opposition showed that liberal ideas had deep roots in Spanish society. Under different leadership, Spain might have emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as a modern, constitutional monarchy, like Britain or France. Instead, Ferdinand's policies ensured that Spain would remain backward, divided, and weak for generations to come. The political instability that characterized 19th century Spain, the loss of the American Empire, the economic stagnation that persisted well into the 20th century, all of these problems can be traced back, at least in part, to the choices Ferdinand made during his reign. Ferdinand's personal character remains one of the most puzzling aspects of his story. Contemporary accounts describe a man of contradictions. He could be charming and gracious when he chose to be, particularly with foreign diplomats who might be useful to him. He was reportedly devoted to his fourth wife, Maria Cristina, and was said to be a loving father to his daughters. Yet this same man could order the execution of former friends and allies without apparent remorse. Some historians have suggested that Ferdinand may have suffered from what we would now recognize as a personality disorder. His apparent inability to form genuine emotional attachments, his tendency to view other people as objects to be manipulated, his capacity for calculated cruelty, all of these traits are consistent with certain psychological conditions. But we must be careful not to impose modern diagnostic categories on historical figures. Whatever Ferdinand's psychological makeup, his actions were the product of choices made by a man who held absolute power and used it absolutely. The question of Ferdinand's sexuality has also intrigued historians, though the evidence is fragmentary and often unreliable. Some contemporary sources suggested that Ferdinand had relationships with men as well as women, though such accusations were commonly made against unpopular rulers and should be treated with skepticism. What is clear is that Ferdinand's 4 marriages were all arranged for political reasons, and that he showed little apparent affection for any of his wives, except the last. More troubling are the persistent rumors about Ferdinand's treatment of servants and courtiers. Multiple sources describe incidents of physical and psychological abuse that went far beyond the normal bounds of royal prerogative. Ferdinand apparently delighted in humiliating those around him, particularly those who were dependent on his favor. Whether these behaviors had a sexual component is unclear, but they certainly suggest a personality that derived pleasure from the suffering of others. Ferdinand's religious beliefs also present a puzzle. He consistently portrayed himself as a defender of Catholic orthodoxy and used the restoration of the Inquisition as one of his first acts upon returning to power. Yet his private behavior suggested little genuine piety. He rarely attended Mass unless it served a political purpose. He showed no interest in theology or religious philosophy. His support for the Church seemed motivated more by political calculation than by genuine faith. This cynical approach to religion was perhaps most evident in Ferdinand's treatment of the Spanish colonies in America. Throughout his reign, Ferdinand insisted that the colonial revolts were the work of godless revolutionaries who threatened Christian civilization. Yet his own policies toward the colonies were marked by the same vindictive cruelty that characterized his domestic rule. When Spanish forces recaptured rebellious territories, Ferdinand's representatives often conducted mass executions and deportations that shocked even hardened military officers. The loss of the American Empire was perhaps Ferdinand's greatest failure as a king. When he returned to power in 1814, most of the Spanish colonies were still recoverable. Skillful diplomacy, combined with meaningful reforms, might have preserved Spanish rule in much of America. Instead, Ferdinand's inflexible insistence on absolute control and his refusal to consider any compromise with colonial grievances ensured that the independence movements would continue until they achieved complete success. By 1824, Spain had lost virtually all of its American territories except Cuba and Puerto Rico. The wealth that had sustained the Spanish monarchy for 3 centuries was gone forever. Spain was reduced to being a second-rate European power, dependent on the goodwill of stronger neighbors. Ferdinand had presided over the greatest territorial loss in Spanish history. Yet he never seemed to grasp the magnitude of his failure. Ferdinand's impact on Spanish culture was equally devastating. The systematic persecution of intellectuals and the closure of universities crippled Spanish intellectual life for generations. Writers, artists, and scholars fled into exile, taking their talents to other countries. Those who remained were forced to work within the narrow confines of official orthodoxy. The vibrant cultural renaissance that had begun in 18th century Spain was cut short, and Spanish culture would not recover its vitality until well into the 19th century. The Spanish language itself bears the scars of Ferdinand's reign. Words like liberal and constitution became associated with treason and revolution. Political discourse was impoverished as entire categories of ideas became literally unspeakable. By the time of Ferdinand's death, Spain was becoming the backward, impoverished country that it would remain for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Ferdinand's military policies were equally counterproductive. The Spanish army that had fought so heroically against Napoleon was systematically purged of officers who had shown any sympathy for liberal ideas. What remained was a force that was politically reliable, but militarily incompetent. This became painfully obvious during the colonial wars in America, where Spanish forces consistently failed to defeat much smaller rebel armies. The Navy, which had once been one of Europe's finest, was allowed to decay through neglect and underfunding. Spanish naval officers, many of whom had gained valuable experience during the Napoleonic Wars, were dismissed or forced into retirement. The result was a fleet that was incapable of maintaining communications with the American colonies, let alone suppressing the rebellions there. Perhaps most damaging of all was Ferdinand's systematic destruction of the Spanish civil service. The professional bureaucracy that had been slowly developing in 18th century Spain was gutted by political purges. Competent administrators were dismissed and replaced with political cronies who lacked the skills and experience necessary to govern effectively. The result was a government that was corrupt, inefficient, and incapable of addressing Spain's mounting problems. Ferdinand's foreign policy was marked by the same vindictive short-sightedness that characterized his domestic rule. He seemed incapable of understanding that Spain's weakness required a careful, nuanced approach to international relations. Instead, he alienated potential allies through his extreme policies and his association with the most reactionary elements in European politics. Ferdinand's relationship with the other European powers was particularly problematic. The Holy Alliance had restored him to power in 1823, but his subsequent policies embarrassed even his conservative allies. The British government, which had supported Spanish independence during the Napoleonic Wars, became increasingly critical of Ferdinand's domestic repression. The French, despite their military intervention on his behalf, grew tired of Ferdinand's constant requests for support against his own subjects. Even the other absolute monarchs of Europe began to distance themselves from Ferdinand as his reputation for cruelty spread. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich, himself no liberal, privately described Ferdinand as a dangerous fanatic whose policies threatened the stability of conservative Europe. The Tsar of Russia, despite his own authoritarian tendencies, was reportedly appalled by accounts of Ferdinand's persecution of political prisoners. Ferdinand's isolation became complete during the final years of his reign. When revolution broke out in France in 1830, Ferdinand found himself without reliable allies. The new liberal government in Paris was openly hostile to Spanish absolutism. The British government, under pressure from public opinion, was increasingly critical of Ferdinand's policies. Even the conservative powers were reluctant to associate themselves with a king whose reputation had become synonymous with reaction and brutality. This international isolation had practical consequences for Spain. Foreign investment dried up as investors lost confidence in Spanish stability. Trade declined as other countries imposed informal sanctions on Spanish goods. Spanish diplomats found themselves persona non grata in many European capitals. Spain, which had once been a major player in European politics, became a pariah state on the margins of international affairs. Ferdinand's treatment of his own family provides another window into his character. His relationship with his brothers was poisoned by suspicion and rivalry. He consistently undermined his brother Carlos, despite the fact that Carlos was his designated heir for most of his reign. He used his position to humiliate his younger brothers and to reward or punish them based on their perceived loyalty to him personally, rather than to the crown. Ferdinand's relationship with his fourth wife, Maria Cristina, was more complex. By most accounts, he was genuinely fond of her, and she seems to have had some moderating influence on his policies during the final years of his reign. But even Maria Cristina lived in fear of her husband's unpredictable moods and vindictive nature. Court observers noted that she was careful never to express opinions that might displease him, and that she avoided any involvement in political matters that might be construed as criticism of his rule. The birth of Ferdinand's daughters, Isabella and Luisa Fernanda, seems to have brought out whatever paternal instincts he possessed. Contemporary accounts describe him as a devoted father who delighted in playing with his children, yet even his love for his daughters was tainted by his political calculations. His decision to change the succession law to allow Isabella to inherit the throne was motivated as much by his desire to prevent his brother Carlos from ruling as by any genuine concern for his daughter's future. Ferdinand's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and isolation. As his health declined, he became ever more suspicious of those around him. He saw plots and conspiracies everywhere, and his responses became increasingly erratic and extreme. Ministers who had served him faithfully for years found themselves suddenly dismissed or arrested on trumped-up charges. Even his closest advisors learned to fear his unpredictable rages. The king's declining health also affected his judgment. Decisions that had once been calculated, if cruel, became arbitrary and capricious. Ferdinand would change his mind repeatedly on important matters, leaving his government in a state of constant confusion. Foreign diplomats reported that it had become almost impossible to conduct serious negotiations with Spanish representatives, because no one could be sure that any agreement would survive Ferdinand's next change of heart. Ferdinand's death on September 29, 1833, came as a relief to many of his subjects. Though few dared express such feelings openly, the funeral was a magnificent state occasion with all the pomp and ceremony that Spanish royalty had always demanded. But the mourning was largely superficial. In private, many Spaniards looked forward to a new beginning under the regency of Maria Cristina and the eventual rule of young Isabella II. Yet Ferdinand's death did not bring the peace that many had hoped for. The Carlist Wars that erupted immediately after his funeral were, in many ways, the inevitable consequence of his policies. By polarizing Spanish society so completely, Ferdinand had made compromise impossible. His supporters and his enemies had become so entrenched in their positions that they could see no alternative to armed conflict. The regency of Maria Cristina began with high hopes for moderation and reform. The new government included many figures who had been persecuted during Ferdinand's reign, and there was talk of a new constitution that would limit royal power while preserving the monarchy. But the Carlist rebellion made such reforms impossible. The need to fight a civil war forced the government to adopt increasingly authoritarian measures, perpetuating many of the patterns that Ferdinand had established. Ferdinand's legacy continued to poison Spanish politics long after his death. The deep divisions that his reign had created between conservatives and liberals, between supporters of absolute monarchy and advocates of constitutional government, between defenders of traditional Catholic values and proponents of secular modernization, would continue to tear Spain apart for generations. The Spain of the mid-19th century bore little resemblance to the great power that had once dominated Europe and the Americas. Politically unstable, economically backward, and internationally isolated, Spain had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy. Foreign observers pointed to Spain as an example of what happened when a country rejected modernity and clung to outdated institutions. Ferdinand's personal reputation only grew darker as more evidence of his cruelties came to light. Memoirs published by political exiles painted an increasingly damning picture of a king who had seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of his subjects. Foreign diplomats who had served in Madrid during Ferdinand's reign wrote accounts that portrayed him as one of the most vindictive rulers in European history. The comparison with other despotic monarchs became inevitable. Historians began to rank Ferdinand alongside figures like Ivan the Terrible of Russia or Caligula of Rome as examples of absolute power corrupted by personal sadism. Unlike these earlier, while his policies were indeed cruel and counterproductive, he was not the monster of pure evil that some writers portrayed him as. He was, rather, a weak man who had been given absolute power and had used that power to compensate for his own inadequacies. His cruelties were real, but they were the cruelties of a petty tyrant rather than those of a grand villain. The question of whether Ferdinand was truly perverted in the sexual sense, as some of his critics claimed, remains unanswered. The evidence is largely circumstantial and often comes from hostile sources. What is clear is that Ferdinand's behavior toward those around him was consistently cruel and manipulative, regardless of whether that behavior had a sexual component. Ferdinand's relationship with power was certainly perverted in the broader sense of the word. He seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the fear and suffering of others. He used his position not to serve his country or his people, but to satisfy his own need for dominance and control. In this sense, Ferdinand was indeed a perverted king, a ruler who had twisted the institution of monarchy into an instrument of personal gratification rather than public service. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is not really about what he did. The historical record is quite clear about his cruelties and failures. The mystery is about why he did it. What drove a man who had every advantage of birth and position to become one of history's most hated monarchs? Was it weakness masquerading as strength? Was it genuine sadism? Was it simply the corruption that absolute power inevitably brings? Perhaps the answer is that Ferdinand was not really mysterious at all. Perhaps he was simply an ordinary man, neither particularly good nor particularly evil, who had been placed in an extraordinary position. The mystery may lie not in Ferdinand himself, but in the institution of absolute monarchy, which could transform an unremarkable individual into a tyrant capable of inflicting immense suffering on millions of people. Ferdinand's reign offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. It shows how quickly a political system can deteriorate when there are no effective limits on the authority of those who rule. It demonstrates how personal weakness and vindictiveness can have consequences far beyond the individuals who possess these traits. The Spain that Ferdinand left behind was a broken country, divided against itself and cut off from the mainstream of European development. It would take generations for Spain to recover from the damage that his reign had inflicted. The political instability that plagued Spain throughout the 19th century, the economic backwardness that persisted well into the 20th century, the cultural isolation that cut Spain off from European intellectual life, all of these problems could be traced back, at least in part, to the choices that Ferdinand made during his 19 years on the throne. Ferdinand VII died believing that he had preserved the Spanish monarchy and defended traditional Catholic civilization against the forces of revolution and impiety. In reality, he had weakened both institutions beyond repair. The monarchy that his daughter inherited was so discredited that it would face constant challenges throughout the 19th century. The Catholic Church that he had claimed to defend was so associated with political reaction that it would struggle to maintain its influence as Spanish society slowly modernized. The final irony of Ferdinand's reign is that his very success in suppressing liberal opposition may have contributed to the radicalization of Spanish politics. By making moderate reform impossible, Ferdinand ensured that when change finally came, it would be sudden and violent. The peaceful evolution toward constitutional monarchy that characterized countries like Britain was made impossible in Spain by Ferdinand's refusal to accept any limits on royal power. Ferdinand's story is ultimately a tragedy, not because we should feel sorry for him, but because his reign was such a catastrophic waste of human potential. Spain in 1814 had everything needed to become a modern, prosperous nation. A proud people who had demonstrated their courage during the War of Independence, a liberal constitution that could have provided the framework for democratic government, and vast natural resources that could have fueled economic development. Instead, Ferdinand's policies ensured that Spain would remain backward and divided for generations. The talents of thousands of liberals and reformers were wasted in exile or prison. The energy of the Spanish people was dissipated in civil wars and political conflicts. The wealth of the nation was squandered on repression and reaction, rather than invested in progress and development. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is not just the mystery of one man's cruelty, but the mystery of how a great nation could be brought so low by the failures of its leadership. It is a story that resonates even today, in an age when the dangers of authoritarian rule are once again becoming apparent around the world. Ferdinand's reign reminds us that freedom and democracy are never guaranteed, that they must be constantly defended against those who would use power for their own purposes rather than for the common good. It shows us that the price of giving unlimited authority to any individual, no matter how legitimate their claim to rule, can be catastrophically high. The documents that survive from Ferdinand's reign paint a picture of a court consumed by fear and suspicion. Ministers walked on eggshells, never knowing when a casual comment might be interpreted as treason. Diplomats from other countries reported that normal political discourse had become almost impossible in Madrid. Everyone knew that the king's spies were everywhere, and that a careless word could lead to imprisonment or death. This atmosphere of terror extended far beyond the royal court. In provinces across Spain, local officials competed to show their loyalty to the king by persecuting suspected liberals with ever greater zeal. Denunciations became commonplace as neighbors turned against neighbors and family members betrayed each other to curry favor with the authorities. The social fabric of Spanish society, already strained by years of war and occupation, began to unravel completely. The Catholic Church, which Ferdinand claimed to champion, found itself in an increasingly difficult position. While the hierarchy generally supported the restoration of absolute monarchy, many individual priests were appalled by the brutality of Ferdinand's persecution. Some clergy members quietly helped political prisoners and their families, risking their own safety to provide comfort to those who had fallen victim to royal vengeance. Ferdinand's treatment of the press was particularly revealing of his character. Rather than simply censoring newspapers and books, he seemed to take personal pleasure in tormenting journalists and writers. Editors were not just forbidden to publish certain ideas, they were forced to print elaborate retractions and apologies that humiliated them before their readers. Writers were not just imprisoned, they were subjected to public trials designed to break their spirits and serve as warnings to others. The king's vindictiveness extended even to seemingly minor matters. Artists who had created works celebrating the Constitution of 1812 found their careers destroyed. Musicians who had composed songs deemed too liberal were banned from performing. Even actors who had appeared in plays with political themes were blacklisted from the stage. Ferdinand's reach seemed to extend into every corner of Spanish cultural life. The economic cost of Ferdinand's reign was staggering. The constant need to maintain a large security apparatus to monitor and suppress opposition drained resources that could have been used for productive investment. The flight of capital and skilled workers to other countries deprived Spain of the human and financial resources needed for development. The loss of international confidence made it almost impossible for Spain to borrow money or attract foreign investment. Trade, which had been recovering slowly after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, stagnated as other countries became reluctant to do business with Ferdinand's government. Spanish merchants found their goods unwelcome in many European ports, not because of any formal boycott, but because of the informal sanctions that liberal governments and their supporters imposed on Spanish products. The situation in the Spanish colonies became increasingly desperate as Ferdinand's policies made any peaceful resolution impossible. Colonial leaders who might have been willing to negotiate some form of autonomy within the Spanish Empire found themselves branded as traitors simply for suggesting reforms. Military commanders who advocated more flexible policies were recalled and often court-martialed for their supposed disloyalty. The result was a series of brutal colonial wars that Spain could not win. Spanish forces, depleted by political purges and demoralized by the knowledge that they were fighting for an unpopular cause, were repeatedly defeated by colonial armies that, while smaller, fought with the passion of men defending their homes and their freedom. Each defeat further weakened Spain's position and made eventual independence for the colonies more likely. Ferdinand's personal obsession with control extended to the most minute details of government administration. He insisted on personally reviewing even minor administrative decisions, creating massive bottlenecks that paralyzed the Spanish bureaucracy. Ministers complained that they could not make even routine decisions without explicit royal approval, and that such approval could take weeks or months to obtain. This micromanagement was not born of diligence or attention to detail, but rather of Ferdinand's pathological need to control every aspect of his kingdom. He seemed incapable of delegating authority, fearing that any independence shown by his subordinates might eventually challenge his own position. The result was a government that was both tyrannical and incompetent, capable of great cruelty, but incapable of effective action. Ferdinand's health problems, which became increasingly severe during the 1820s, added another layer of instability to Spanish government. The king suffered from what appear to have been severe digestive disorders, possibly related to stress, that left him incapacitated for weeks at a time. During these periods, government virtually ground to a halt, since no one dared make important decisions in the king's absence. These episodes of illness also seemed to worsen Ferdinand's already difficult personality. Court observers noted that he became even more suspicious and vindictive after recovering from his attacks. Some historians have suggested that Ferdinand's physical suffering may have contributed to his psychological cruelty, though this explanation should not be used to excuse his behavior. The question of Ferdinand's mental state has intrigued historians for generations. While we cannot diagnose historical figures with modern psychological categories, it is clear that Ferdinand displayed many characteristics that we would now associate with certain personality disorders. His apparent inability to empathize with others, his need for constant validation, his tendency to see threats everywhere. All of these traits suggest a deeply troubled individual. But whatever Ferdinand's psychological makeup, his actions were the product of choices made by a man who understood the consequences of his decisions. He was not insane in any legal sense. He was capable of complex political calculations and showed considerable cunning in dealing with foreign powers and domestic opponents. His cruelty was not the random violence of a madman, but the calculated brutality of a tyrant who used terror as a tool of governance. The international reaction to Ferdinand's reign provides important context for understanding just how extreme his policies were, even by the standards of his time. While absolute monarchy was still the norm in much of Europe, most rulers had learned to exercise their power with at least some restraint. The kind of systematic persecution that Ferdinand practiced was already becoming unacceptable to European opinion. The British government, which had supported Spanish independence during the Napoleonic Wars and had initially welcomed Ferdinand's restoration, became increasingly critical of his domestic policies. British newspapers regularly published accounts of Spanish political prisoners and their sufferings, creating a public opinion that was hostile to Ferdinand's regime. This hostility had practical consequences as British merchants and investors became reluctant to do business with Spain. The French government found itself in a particularly awkward position. Having intervened militarily to restore Ferdinand's absolute power in 1823, France was partially responsible for the subsequent persecution. French liberal politicians regularly attacked their government's Spanish policy, arguing that France was complicit in Ferdinand's crimes. This domestic pressure made it increasingly difficult for the French government to continue supporting Ferdinand's regime. Even the conservative powers of the Holy Alliance began to distance themselves from Ferdinand as his reputation became a liability. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich, architect of the post-Napoleonic conservative order, privately complained that Ferdinand's extremism was giving absolutism a bad name throughout Europe. The Tsar of Russia, despite his own authoritarian tendencies, was reportedly appalled by Ferdinand's treatment of political prisoners. This international isolation had serious consequences for Spain's security. When liberal revolutions broke out across Europe in 1830, Ferdinand found himself without reliable allies. The new liberal government in France was openly hostile to Spanish absolutism. The British government, under pressure from public opinion, was increasingly critical of Ferdinand's policies. Even his former conservative allies were reluctant to come to his aid. Ferdinand's response to this isolation was characteristically vindictive. Rather than moderating his policies to regain international support, He became even more extreme in his persecution of domestic opponents. He seemed to view international criticism as proof that liberal ideas were spreading throughout Europe, and he was determined to prevent such ideas from taking root in Spain. The king's paranoia about foreign influence led to increasingly bizarre policies. Spanish students were forbidden to study abroad, lest they be contaminated by liberal ideas. Foreign books and newspapers were banned, even those that had no political content. Spanish diplomats were instructed to avoid contact with liberal politicians in the countries where they served, severely limiting their effectiveness. These policies further isolated Spain from the mainstream of European development. While other countries were experiencing rapid technological and economic progress, Spain remained trapped in an increasingly obsolete system of government and social organization. The gap between Spain and the rest of Europe widened with each passing year, and Ferdinand's policies ensured that this gap would continue to grow. The tragedy of Ferdinand's reign becomes even more apparent when we consider what might have been. Spain in 1814 had enormous potential for renewal and growth. The War of Independence had demonstrated the Spanish people's capacity for heroism and sacrifice. The Constitution of 1812 had shown that Spanish political thinkers were capable of creating progressive institutions. The vast resources of the American colonies could have funded a program of modernization and development. Instead, Ferdinand's choices led Spain down a path of decline and stagnation that would persist for generations. The political instability that characterized 19th century Spain, the loss of the colonial empire, the economic backwardness that made Spain the poor man of Europe. All of these problems can be traced back, at least in part, to the decisions made during Ferdinand's reign. Ferdinand's impact on Spanish women deserves particular attention. The liberal constitution of 1812 had begun to recognize certain rights for women, particularly in matters of property and inheritance. Ferdinand's restoration of absolute monarchy swept away these modest gains and reinforced the most restrictive aspects of traditional Spanish society. Women who had been active in the liberal movement found themselves particular targets of Ferdinand's persecution. Some were imprisoned alongside their husbands or fathers. Others were forced into exile, losing their property and their social position. The message was clear. Women who dared to involve themselves in political matters would face the same brutal consequences as men. Ferdinand's own treatment of the women in his life reflected his broader attitude toward those he considered inferior. His first 3 wives were treated more as political instruments than as human beings. Even his 4th wife, Maria Cristina, for whom he apparently felt genuine affection, was kept in a state of constant anxiety about his unpredictable moods and demands. The impact on Spanish intellectual life was equally devastating. The universities, which had been centers of Enlightenment thinking in the 18th century, were systematically purged of professors who might harbor liberal sympathies. The curriculum was restricted to approved subjects that posed no challenge to traditional authority. Students were subjected to constant surveillance, and any sign of independent thinking was severely punished. The result was the intellectual impoverishment of an entire generation of Spaniards. Young people who might have become great scientists, philosophers, or artists were instead forced to conform to the narrow orthodoxy of Ferdinand's regime. Those with talent and ambition often chose exile over intellectual suffocation, depriving Spain of their contributions. Spanish literature during Ferdinand's reign reflected the climate of fear and repression that pervaded the country. Writers learned to express their ideas in coded language, using allegory and metaphor to convey thoughts that could not be stated directly. The rich tradition of Spanish satirical writing, which had flourished in the 18th century, virtually disappeared as authors feared that their wit might be interpreted as subversion. The theater, which had been a vibrant part of Spanish cultural life, was subjected to particularly heavy censorship. Plays were required to promote approved moral and political values. Works that had been performed freely before Ferdinand's return were banned or heavily edited. Actors and playwrights learned to police themselves, knowing that any deviation from approved themes could end their careers. Even religious art and literature were affected by Ferdinand's policies. While the king claimed to be defending Catholic orthodoxy, his heavy-handed approach to censorship stifled genuine religious expression. Artists and writers found themselves caught between the demands of authentic spiritual expression and the requirements of political conformity. The long-term cultural consequences of Ferdinand's reign were profound. Spain, which had been beginning to participate in the European Enlightenment and Romantic movements, was cut off from these intellectual currents for a crucial period in their development. When Spanish culture finally began to recover in the mid-19th century, it had to make up for lost time, struggling to catch up with developments that had passed it by. Ferdinand's legacy in terms of political culture was equally damaging. His reign taught Spaniards that political opposition was not just dangerous, but treasonous. The idea that loyal citizens might disagree with government policy while remaining patriotic became almost incomprehensible. Political discourse was reduced to a simple choice between absolute loyalty and treacherous rebellion. This polarization of political life had consequences that extended far beyond Ferdinand's reign. The Spanish political system never developed the traditions of loyal opposition and peaceful transfer of power that characterized more stable democracies. Instead, Spanish politics remained characterized by extremism and violence well into the 20th century. The Carlist Wars that began immediately after Ferdinand's death were in many ways the inevitable consequence of his policies. By making moderate positions impossible and polarizing Spanish society completely, Ferdinand had created a situation where compromise became impossible. His supporters and opponents had become so entrenched in their positions that they could see no alternative to armed conflict. The First Carlist War, which lasted from 1833 to 1840, was fought with particular savagery. Both sides committed atrocities that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to the brutalities of war. Prisoners were routinely executed. Civilians suspected of supporting the enemy were murdered. Entire communities were destroyed in reprisal attacks. This pattern of political violence, established during Ferdinand's reign and continued during the Carlist Wars, became a persistent feature of Spanish political life. The Second Carlist War, 1846 to 1849, and the Third Carlist War, 1872 to 1876, demonstrated that the divisions Ferdinand had created were deep and lasting. Even the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 can be seen, in part, as the final playing out of conflicts that had their roots in Ferdinand's reign. The economic legacy of Ferdinand's policies was equally destructive. The systematic destruction of Spain's commercial and professional classes through persecution and exile deprived the country of the human capital needed for economic development. The flight of capital to safer countries made investment in Spanish industry and infrastructure almost impossible. Spain's exclusion from the mainstream of European economic development during Ferdinand's reign had lasting consequences. While other countries were building railroads, developing factories, and modernizing their agricultural systems, Spain remained trapped in pre-industrial patterns of production and trade. When Spain finally began to modernize in the late 19th century, it was starting from a position of severe disadvantage. The loss of the American colonies, which was largely complete by the time of Ferdinand's death, deprived Spain of the wealth that had sustained it for 3 centuries. The gold and silver of the Americas had allowed Spain to maintain its position as a great power, despite fundamental weaknesses in its domestic economy. Without colonial wealth, Spain's underlying economic problems became impossible to ignore. Ferdinand's foreign policy failures also had long-term consequences for Spain's international position. The country that had once been a major player in European politics became a marginal power whose opinions carried little weight in international affairs. Spain's diplomatic isolation during Ferdinand's reign established a pattern of irrelevance that would persist for generations. The question of how different Spanish history might have been under different leadership is fascinating to consider. If Ferdinand had been willing to accept the limitations of constitutional monarchy, Spain might have evolved peacefully into a modern democratic state. If he had shown greater flexibility in dealing with the American colonies, much of the Spanish Empire might have been preserved in some form. Instead, Ferdinand's rigidity and vindictiveness ensured that Spain would lose both its empire and its domestic stability. The choices he made during his 19-year reign had consequences that extended far beyond his own lifetime, shaping Spanish history for generations to come. The personal tragedy of Ferdinand VII lies not just in what he did, but in what he might have been. Born into a position of enormous privilege and responsibility, he had every opportunity to become a great king. Instead, he chose to use his power to settle personal scores and satisfy his own psychological needs, regardless of the cost to his country and his people. Ferdinand's story serves as a powerful reminder of the corrupting influence of absolute power. It shows how even seemingly ordinary individuals can become monsters when they are freed from all external constraints on their behavior. It demonstrates the importance of institutional checks and balances in preventing the abuse of power. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is ultimately not about his sexuality or his private perversions, but about the perversion of power itself. It is about how a man who should have been the guardian of his people's welfare became instead their greatest enemy. It is about how the institution of monarchy, which was supposed to provide stability and continuity, became instead a source of chaos and destruction. Ferdinand's reign reminds us that the price of political freedom is eternal vigilance. It shows us that democratic institutions and constitutional government are not luxuries that can be dispensed with in times of crisis, but necessities that become even more important when a nation faces challenges. It teaches us that those who promise to restore order through the elimination of opposition usually create more disorder than they prevent. As we look back on Ferdinand's reign from our modern perspective, we can see clearly the choices that led Spain down the path of decline and stagnation. We can identify the moments when different decisions might have led to different outcomes. But we should remember that the people who lived through Ferdinand's reign did not have the benefit of historical hindsight. They had to make their choices based on incomplete information and uncertain prospects. Some chose to resist Ferdinand's tyranny despite the enormous personal cost. These men and women, liberals and constitutionalists, who sacrificed their careers, their property, and often their lives for their principles, deserve to be remembered as heroes. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of ideas to inspire sacrifice. Others chose accommodation with Ferdinand's regime, either out of fear or out of genuine belief in absolute monarchy. While we may judge their choices harshly, we should remember that they too were products of their time and circumstances. The climate of fear that Ferdinand created was designed to make resistance seem futile and collaboration seem like the only rational choice. The tragedy of Ferdinand's reign is that it did not have to happen. Spain had the resources, the talent, and the opportunity to become a modern, prosperous nation. The failure was not in the Spanish people or in Spanish institutions, but in the man who held ultimate power and chose to use that power destructively rather than constructively. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, leaving behind a daughter who would inherit a kingdom torn apart by civil war and a legacy of division that would haunt Spain for generations. His funeral was magnificent, befitting a king of Spain, but the mourning was largely ceremonial. In private, many Spaniards looked forward to a new beginning, hoping that the death of the tyrant might herald the birth of a new and better Spain. That hope would be only partially fulfilled. The Spain that emerged from Ferdinand's reign was indeed different from the Spain he had tried to preserve, but it was also scarred by the trauma of his rule. The political instability, economic backwardness, and social division that characterized 19th century Spain were all, in part, the legacy of Ferdinand's choices. The story of Ferdinand VII is more than just the biography of a cruel king. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of constitutional government. It is a reminder that the health of a nation depends not just on the wisdom of its laws or the wealth of its resources, but on the character of those entrusted with power. In the end, Ferdinand VII was not just a bad king, but a destructive force that held back Spanish development for generations. His reign stands as one of the clearest examples in modern history of how individual choices can have enormous historical consequences. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is not really mysterious at all. It is the all-too-familiar story of power corrupted and talent wasted, of opportunities squandered and potential destroyed. The lessons of Ferdinand's reign remain relevant today, in an age when democratic institutions face new challenges and authoritarian leaders seek to concentrate power in their own hands. Ferdinand's story reminds us that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance, but active resistance to those who would destroy constitutional government in the name of order, tradition, or national greatness. The Spanish people eventually overcame the legacy of Ferdinand's reign, but it took generations of struggle and sacrifice. The vibrant democracy that Spain enjoys today was built on the ruins of the system that Ferdinand tried so desperately to preserve. His failure was complete, but the cost of that failure was paid by millions of Spaniards who deserved better from their king and their country. Ferdinand VII remains one of history's most controversial monarchs, a man whose reign serves as a permanent reminder of what can happen when power is exercised without wisdom, restraint, or compassion. His story is the story of Spain's lost decades, of opportunities squandered and potential destroyed. It is a story that continues to resonate today, as nations around the world struggle to balance the need for effective government with the equally important need to protect individual rights and democratic institutions. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is solved not by understanding his personal psychology or his private behavior, but by recognizing him for what he was, a weak man given absolute power who used that power to compensate for his own inadequacies at the expense of his nation and his people. In the end, that may be the most damning verdict of all.